Okay, I think we're live. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eleanor Terrett. I'm host of the Crypto in America podcast and newsletter. I'll be moderating today's panel on navigating economic, regulatory, and geopolitical implications of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. I'm joined today by Ben Werkman. He's the founder at NumerisX, a Bitcoin treasury consulting firm. Jessi Goostree, she's the chief operating officer at the Texas Blockchain Council, and Hailey Miller, the Director of Government Relations and Public Policy at Digital Power Network, a policy advocacy group for Bitcoin mining. So, to kick off the conversation, let's start with President Trump's executive order, because the idea of establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve in the US has been circulating among proponents of Bitcoin and crypto for years. But it took a major step towards reality last month when Trump signed the executive order officially creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve, as well as the digital asset stockpile. Now, we know the basis for the executive order is to first stop selling Bitcoin. It's been estimated that the US government currently holds about 200,000 Bitcoin, and that's valued at today's price is about $16.5 billion. So that's the most of any government in the world, actually, a little bit more than China. So some might say that we already have a strategic reserve. So, Jessi, my first question is to you. Is it not enough to simply hold the Bitcoin we have currently?
Thanks for the question. Yes, great to be here today. Hi, everyone. I think, holding Bitcoin passively is a good start, but if we stop there, we really miss a strategic moment. So think of it like the early days of the US gold reserve. Simply holding on to what we happen to acquire really wasn't the playbook. We made deliberate choices to grow that reserve because they gave us leverage, credibility, and security on a global stage. Bitcoin is emerging as a monetary asset that countries are now competing for. If the US wants to lead and not lag, we need to treat this like a modern day arms race. Only instead of weapons, it's code and capital. Proactively acquiring more Bitcoin, especially in a budget neutral way, strengthens our position geopolitically and signals that we are serious about monetary sovereignty in a digital age. And look, China's already doing this and we need to keep pace. And it doesn't belong to them or us or the IMF. We recognize this, but we need to be in the game and we need to be in this area and leading. And as Americans, we don't just sit on our assets, we build, we lead, and we understand the value of investing in future infrastructure.
Love that. Sit on our assets. Clever. Ben, I want to ask the same question to you. Someone who is, I think you're a pretty objective person. Obviously, you are. Everybody here is a proponent of Bitcoin, but just objectively, from someone who may not be, you work with people a lot who may be skeptical of Bitcoin. If they're thinking about adding it to their treasuries, they might say, "I'm really not familiar with it. Tell me more about it. I really don't know much." So, someone from that perspective, how would they see this? I mean, is it really a risk of falling behind? Is it just a messaging from Bitcoin proponents that, if we don't start buying, it's going to be bad in the long term? Is it really, do you see it as a strategic move for the US to actively buy Bitcoin in comparison with other countries?
I do. Yeah. And I think the conversation ultimately needs to shift away from a fear response and to a proactive response. I think initially when people started thinking about Bitcoin as a strategic asset for the nation, they thought about it as a pivot away from what we're already strong at, like we were abandoning the dollar somehow and sending that message out to the world. And I don't think that's the case at all. The one thing about the United States that we all know is we've never been afraid to lead. We've led all throughout history since we founded this nation. It was a leading moment. We led through the Industrial Revolution. We've led through the technology revolution. And now we've got a new one in financial and monetary. And I don't think that the US wants to sit back and rest on what's worked for us for a couple hundred years now and ignore what's emerging right in front of us. We've got the opportunity at the moment to shape the future and not receive the future. And I think that as a nation, if we're forward looking, we start to embrace these types of digital assets and we stop trying to fight them so we can find a way for them to drive value to our nation and not be a threat. But I do think that strategically for the country, it's a very easy case to make, because if you look at all the other nations, and particularly if you look at what happened with Russia when they got cut off from the SWIFT network, I think that there was a message that went out there to these other nations that said you need to evaluate the assets that give you sovereignty so that you're not fully reliant on these networks that have been ingrained across our financial systems. And so from the United States perspective, given we are one of those leaders now, I think integrating and adopting an asset like Bitcoin puts us in a position to maintain our power standing in the financial world, but also where we can help shape that future for a lot of our allies as well.
Interesting. I want to touch on another part of the executive order. It was directing the Commerce and Treasury secretaries to start sussing out budget neutral ways to buy Bitcoin, and budget neutral meaning that it doesn't cost the American taxpayers a thing. Haley, Digital Power Network did a policy paper recently. It laid out a blueprint for how the US can lead by implementing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. It included some examples of how to buy Bitcoin in a budget neutral way. I remember seeing the asset rebalancing, where the government reallocates some of its value it already holds in assets like gold and foreign currency and convert a small portion of the proceeds from that into Bitcoin. That could be one way. The White House Crypto Council Executive Director Bo Hines told Anthony Pompliano recently that even proceeds from tariffs is actually on the table when it comes to thinking about ways to buy Bitcoin responsibly. In your opinion, what's the least controversial way for the US to buy Bitcoin that you think the government might be thinking about right now?
One of the most compelling aspects of a strategic Bitcoin reserve is that it can be built in a budget neutral way without congressional appropriations or deficit spending. And that's going to be the least controversial path moving forward. It's politically viable, economically efficient, and aligns with our broader national priorities. The key here is going to be about reallocation, not creation. We're not asking taxpayers to fund a new program. We're asking the government to repurpose value it already holds. That could mean converting a small portion of gold, foreign currencies, or even surplus commodities into Bitcoin gradually, transparently, without disrupting traditional reserve management. Now, the idea of selling gold to buy Bitcoin often grabs headlines, but it's not strictly necessary. What matters more is the symbolism, the signal that the US is rebalancing for the realities of a digital era. At the same time, we have another underutilized pathway, private sector miners. Through voluntary block reward contribution programs, US-based miners could direct a percentage of newly mined Bitcoin into sovereign reserve custody. These programs could be incentivized through energy credits, tax treatment, or public-private infrastructure partnerships. We're already seeing models like this piloted in a few US states. With federal coordination, they could scale nationally very quickly. And there are other creative models as well. Idle federal data centers, underused energy assets, even DOE facilities in rural or energy-rich regions. These aren't just technical options, they're strategic. But just as important as how we fund the reserve is going to be how we communicate about it. Because public trust is the precondition for political momentum, for many Americans, Bitcoin still feels abstract, volatile, technical, disconnected from the real economy. That perception doesn't shift through branding, it shifts through structure, transparency, and education. This isn't about speculation, this is about geoeconomic positioning. A strategic Bitcoin reserve is a long-term national insurance policy, one that protects US stability against systemic shocks. And so the least controversial path is also the most strategic. Let's build quietly, build smartly, and build in a way that gives US optionality in a future that we can't fully predict.
You mentioned public trust. Ben, there's a lot of skeptics out there, especially among lawmakers who don't see Bitcoin as having an intrinsic value. It's inherently volatile. Sometimes we see swings of 20 to 30% in a normal cycle. In a traditional stock market, that's a lot, but in a cryptocurrency market, it's not. It's pretty normal. Bitcoin also has a historical association with bad actors. If you think about the Silk Road and other initiatives where the government has come in to like seize Bitcoin as part of transactions made by bad actors, and buying Bitcoin and adding it to our government reserves will obviously take an act of Congress, but it will also take, as Haley mentioned, public trust. And how do we build public trust? I guess aside from education, because education it's easy to say we just have to educate people, but how do we do that? But then more broadly, like how do you just build public trust in an asset frankly has nothing backing it, right? That's one of the arguments, but also has such volatility. How do we get the world to see Bitcoin as something that's either on a par with gold or better than gold?
Yeah, I think it's completely fair that there's skepticism. When we look at Bitcoin, it's still new in the grand scheme of the global financial system, and it's challenging decades and hundreds of years, really, of what people have believed about finance. And I think what's often misunderstood is that while Bitcoin is volatile, it's also decentralized and it has a fixed supply. And those characteristics are really unique. Some people see them as bugs, but they're not, right? They're a feature of this network. And they're features that make it fundamentally different from any other asset that the US is ever going to hold in its reserve. So when people say Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, I think the first thing that we really have to ask them is, what's giving all the other assets value that they see in the world? The dollar isn't really backed by gold. It's backed by belief. It's backed by trust in a system. It's backed by scarcity relative to demand globally. And Bitcoin, similar to gold, has no counterparty risk, but unlike gold, it's natively digital, something that we see emerging in the future in front of us that we really need to embrace. So, Bitcoin is volatile, but so is the dollar during war times, gold during every transition in monetary history that we can remember. So volatility in the early stages of monetization is a pretty normal feature to have. And what matters most in an asset that you're taking on as strategic is going to be the long-term trajectory of that asset and that adoption cycle. So if we look over a 5 to 10-year horizon, Bitcoin's been one of the most consistent performing assets that have been available out there. And the volatility has decreased slightly as the adoption has started to increase. And I think that right now we're in those early stages where volatility is going to be around, but it's going to be a feature for the asset and not necessarily a bug that it possesses. So public trust, I don't think just comes from telling people that Bitcoin's valuable. I think we really need to show them why. And transparency is one of those really key components of Bitcoin that makes it unique. And if we're going to continue adding Bitcoin to the national balance sheet, it's going to need to be done open and transparently to the public with public disclosure, transparent reporting, and education around it. And when the executive order got signed, I think you started to see the first phases of that education right there on the White House website. It said Bitcoin was digital gold. And I think that was a really big statement to see coming directly from the White House. And what the citizens really need to see is that this isn't about speculation at a national level. It's about sovereignty. It's about resilience. And it's about positioning the US for a future that does include those digital assets. So we need to stop thinking about Bitcoin through the lens of all the past mistakes that we've seen from bad actors. And I think we need to acknowledge that for a lot of new technologies, the bad actors are actually some of the ones that lead the way. A lot of innovation actually happens through those paths. But I think that we got past that path now, and now we're starting to see it through a lens of future opportunity and what it can bring to the prosperity narrative for the country. So if we want to lead, we're not going to be able to wait until an asset is completely safe and boring. We need to take the calculated and strategic steps early on while that upside is right in front of us, where we can start to guide the future and not receive the future.
Great answer. Jessi, are there any initiatives that the Texas Blockchain Council is doing on the ground in terms of trying to raise awareness about strategic Bitcoin reserve? I know there's legislation going through the state legislature, which we can touch on later. But aside from that, to kind of get more awareness or education on the ground, is there anything the council is doing specifically to advance that?
Yes, so the Texas legislature meets every 2 years. So we are very busy right now. We are in the session. So we are tracking about 45 bills. Currently really involved is about 15. And the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is obviously our big one that everyone's talking about. So that's passed through the Senate, currently picked up at a House committee right now. So, the last administration sort of at the federal level kind of handcuffed what we were able to do federally. And so the states really have led the way. I know our president, founder of the Texas Blockchain Council, is doing a keynote to go in deeper about exactly what we're doing at the state level a little bit later this afternoon at the summit. So please tune in to hear Lee talk about that in more detail. But we're really excited about everything that Texas is doing, and we hope to be sort of a blueprint for all the other states as well.
Do you expect to be a blueprint for the federal level as well?
I think a lot of the things that we are doing could apply, but it remains to be seen. We certainly are encouraged by the new administration's openness to the digital assets and Bitcoin.
Yeah, staying on the policy topic, because that's kind of my bread and butter and what I like to cover. But Hailey, you're Director of Government Relations. I'm curious to know how your conversations with lawmakers surrounding the strategic reserve are going since Senator Lummis, since she reintroduced her Bitcoin Act, and then there's a House companion bill to go along with that. Has there been any shift or fresh interest in the people that you've been speaking to on the Hill?
I think what we're seeing right now is a real shift, not just in interest, but in framing. Senator Lummis's reintroduction of the Bitcoin Act with a companion from Congressman Begich has given this issue formal shape in Congress. And that's moved the conversation from should we do this to how do we do this well. In my conversations on the Hill, I'm seeing a new kind of alignment Lawmakers who once viewed Bitcoin as purely financial are now recognizing its multidimensional value. That's as a strategic asset, as a digital infrastructure layer, as a geopolitical signal. And the questions they're asking, they're also becoming more sophisticated. How do we accumulate Bitcoin responsibly without adding to the deficit? How do we protect custody and ensure it isn't misused across agencies? And how do we incorporate US miners, not as a side industry, but as infrastructure partners? So these are really good questions, and they're coming from both sides of the aisle. There's also growing recognition that this reserve is not about abandoning the dollar. That's a myth I think we need to correct. The dollar is our global exchange medium. Bitcoin is a long-term store of value. They're complementary, not competitive. Holding both strengthens our national balance sheet, and it gives the US an asymmetric hedge for a range of future economic scenarios. This kind of reserve diversification, it's what great powers already do. China and the EU are actively exploring digital reserve frameworks, and if the US lags behind, we look unprepared. But if we lead, we reinforce the dollar's position as the most strategically adaptive currency in the world, and this moment has real geopolitical weight. A US decision to hold Bitcoin at the sovereign level will send global signals, it will prompt allies to reevaluate their own reserves, and it will force competitors to adjust. It also opens the door to international collaboration on custody, on emissions transparency, and on best practices for decentralized infrastructure. If we hesitate, authoritarian regimes will define the rules, but if we act, we can set the standards ourselves. So yes, the momentum on Capitol Hill is real, and I believe we're at the beginning of a generational shift from treating digital assets as a compliance issue to recognizing them as a core element of American strategy in the 21st century.
That's awesome to hear, especially the bipartisanship nature of the conversations you've been having. Ben, I just want to circle back at the risk of, repeating questions or repeating content. I just want to get your take on I guess from your position as someone who advises companies putting Bitcoin on their treasury. Do you think, is this a question you get a lot about the dollar being undermined by Bitcoin? Is it something that when people come to you, they say, oh, Bitcoin might be great and everything, but what about the challenging it as the global reserve currency? What's kind of what's your comeback line for that? Or what's your argument against that when people say, is it undermining the dollar?
Sorry about that. People look at it in two ways. They look at it as undermining the dollar, and they also look at what type of a threat could it potentially play to the US Treasuries market. And the US Treasuries market's so ingrained globally that that's a big concern for a lot of these players. And I think that treasuries are going to remain pretty essential in global finance because they serve a function right now that Bitcoin doesn't, and that's around scale and stability in the credit system. So when you look at some of the organizations that need this, you look at governments, you look at pensions, you look at insurers, what they need is duration and yield that's in a very predictable manner. And right now, Bitcoin doesn't compete with that. You're starting to see some of that emerging through the use of corporate balance sheets holding Bitcoin, where they can essentially securitize Bitcoin themselves and start to provide some duration and yield, but not even remotely close to the scale that some of these parties need. And right now, I view Bitcoin more as competing with gold in the offshore reserves that are just sitting idle. So when I look at Bitcoin and I think, what can it do? I think to Hailey's point, it could serve as a strategic hedge, right? It's an incorruptible, globally recognized store of value now, and it doesn't depend on any nation. And I think that's a really important feature here. So adding it alongside the treasuries, I don't think threatens the dollar. I think it actually strengthens US credibility by showing that what we're doing is thinking long term and we're willing to lead in those emerging financial architectures that are coming out. So if we look back to, for instance, when the US first added gold to the reserves, it wasn't an admission of weakness, right? Which is what I think a lot of the narrative is around Bitcoin. It was a signal to the world of strength. And I think Bitcoin's going to play a similar role in this next chapter. And I think it can really help stabilize the monetary foundation without the requirement of completely displacing all the tools we have ingrained in the financial system today. I think it can be complementary to them. So I don't see it as a competition between old and new. I see this more as a layered reserve strategy, right? You've got treasuries for liquidity and credit, and you've got Bitcoin for long-term sovereignty and resiliency. And if we lead the transition with intelligence, I don't think the dollar gets weaker. I think it gets smarter.
Interesting. What are some of the other concerns, Ben, that you hear from clients who may or may not want to add Bitcoin to their treasury? If some are skeptical, they want to learn more, what's sort of a common theme that you're hearing throughout people that you speak to?
Yeah, the hardest thing for a lot of these companies to wrap their head around is how Bitcoin becomes a strategic part of how they move forward as a company. And so the conversations don't traditionally start with Bitcoin first. First, they really need to look at who they are as an organization, who they've been, and what it is that made them successful in the first place. And a lot of these companies, when they recognize that they've gotten, several leadership moves beyond the people that took the initial risk, they figured out that they got complacent and they got too safe in their industries. And when they couple that and they start losing the growth that was initially in the organization and they start to see that excitement potentially bleed out of their equity in the markets, they start to look at what can they do to reignite that interest and how do they solidify themselves and build a war chest for whatever the next transformation is that they're going to make. So any good company is going to be on a continuous journey of transformation. You're never going to be static for very long because innovation doesn't take a break for anybody. And they're starting to notice that, and AI is really highlighting this amongst a lot of these corporations. And so if you are in even a high-tech organization and you look at the speed at which AI is emerging into the market, you start to look at how can I strengthen my company? Because if all I did was focus on the income statement and growth at all costs for so long, how do I pivot that and build a solid foundation underneath my company that's going to allow me to endure and pivot as I need to? And that's usually the opening door for them to start discussing using their treasury more active, because treasuries for a very long time were a forgotten function within organizations. They were kind of down in the basement next to the auditors in the rooms with no windows. So it wasn't this area that companies were focusing on as a value creation partner for shareholders. But that's shifting because now they're finding that if they can be early enough to adopting the next round of digital capital, which is Bitcoin, and they've seen other companies prove out the path, prove out the markets, and de-risk that transaction of shifting dollars into Bitcoin on your balance sheet, they're finding that it positions themselves strategically, even amongst their peers, for the long term. And that's when they start to really see the power that Bitcoin can bring to them by injecting the growth of that network directly into their balance sheet and kind of adopting the growth curve of Bitcoin as a corporation. So it's less about orange pilling the executives right away. It's more about figuring out what it is that concerns them about the future and showing them where the opportunities are to pivot to make that future a little brighter for them.
Interesting. I was on a panel earlier, and one of the panelists said that he thinks Bitcoin is sort of the monkey bar between gold and between AI. And the way that you just described that is exactly how I think of it as well. And probably something that companies are also thinking about, how they're positioning themselves. I do want to leave some time for Q&A. I do see a couple in the Q&A box, but I do just want to circle back quickly to just talk quickly about the Senator Lummis's Bitcoin Act. Just a question that I have, and I'm going to give this one to Jessi. She has been a part of the pitch, I guess, for the bill. Is that buying Bitcoin and having the U.S. hold it can help us with our national debt. It'll help us pay off our national debt, which right now stands at almost 37 trillion, and that debt grows at about $1 trillion per year. So she wants to help pay that off with Bitcoin. I heard her talk at the Digital Chamber Summit, and she said she's been looking for ways to help the government pay off their debt since she started in the Wyoming legislature at 24 years old. And she said when she found Bitcoin, she thought this was like her aha moment. Basically, she calls it the Louisiana Purchase moment for the U.S. So Jessi, is this realistic? I mean, what would need to happen in order to pull something like that off, to pay off national debt with something like Bitcoin?
Right. So I think it's still really early and there's a lot of chatter around this. So it's hard to say exactly how this will unfold. Obviously, servicing the national debt will need to be done in a calm environment, which I don't think we are currently experiencing. The idea of using Bitcoin to tackle the national debt is definitely intriguing. But first, we would need to have enough Bitcoin to even make a dent. I think there's a lot to admire about the vision behind Senator Lummis's bill. But considering we're talking about $37 trillion, that's a massive lift. Not a lot would need to happen, and it's not around the corner, but I think it's a powerful tool to have on the table. So do I think we're going to buy Bitcoin right now and then wait for it to go to $1 million and pay off the national debt? No. But do I think there's some short-term ideas worth exploring? Absolutely. I'm particularly interested in learning more about how we might be able to leverage some of the market neutral purchase strategies that Hailey talked about, to hedge against inflation, start paying off at least maybe some of the interest on some of that debt. I think that, those are some of the things that we can maybe explore in the shorter term. Senator Lummis is such a big advocate for us. I hugely admire all of these things that she's putting on the table, and just even having it out there and having it part of the national discussion is hugely admirable. And so I'm grateful for her for that.
Awesome. All right. So we got 3 questions in the chat and we got 3 minutes left on the clock. So we'll do a little rapid fire here. I'm going to start with Ethan Cox's question to Hailey. He says, can you give your assessment on the Bitcoin Act, particularly its ability to pass committee and action items at large that can be taken against any holdups?
So I think that's a great question. I think the bill is currently under consideration by the Senate Banking Committee, which is chaired by Senator Tim Scott, who's also a big industry proponent. I think there's a couple of items that are potentially holding up the legislation at this part. Building cross-party support is going to be crucial. Engaging with committee members from both parties to address our concerns and highlight the strategic importance of a Bitcoin reserve can facilitate the process, as well as to continue to advance public advocacy. We need to continue to mobilize support from the industry through education and advocacy to create a favorable environment for the bill's advancement. So by implementing these action items, we can move forward towards these legislative hurdles and advancing the bills through the necessary channels.
Great. And then I'll give this one to Ben. What mechanisms or financial instruments could be implemented to mitigate the risks of holding Bitcoin in the event of a market crash or prolonged bear cycle?
Yeah, I think the beauty with what we've seen with the adoption in the financial markets is that it brings a lot of products to the market that are easily accessible as hedging instruments. So things like Bitcoin options and futures. But it's also about just figuring out the right asset mix to hold. So diversified reserve mixes are always a good option where you can kind of create your own risk profile while integrating Bitcoin. But if the specific concern is typically going to be around those drawdowns during the bear markets, what you're going to be looking at is all of these derivatives that have entered the market around Bitcoin and finding the optimal mix for you to really lessen the impact of that and give yourself the ability to keep accumulating throughout that cycle as well.
All right, awesome. And then last one, I'll give this to any of you guys. If one of you wants to pick it up, let me know. But the question is, if Bitcoin becomes a geopolitical asset, what protections or support mechanisms can African countries advocate for to prevent becoming targets of digital exploitation or financial manipulation?
And I can take that one too, if people
All
want.
right, go ahead, Ben.
I would say that it starts with making sure that Africa becomes really active in advocating in the market around this. And I think particularly they would need to advocate around things like self-custody, open source infrastructure, and really inclusive global standards, because the power of Bitcoin is going to lie in the neutrality of it. And putting protections in place that keep sovereign access is going to be really important so that they're not fully depending on Western custodians and intermediaries. So regional collaborations could help, making sure that you guys are innovating within Africa and making sure Africa's not just a participant, but a builder in what this is going to look like.
Awesome answer. All right, well, that wraps us up for this session. Thank you so much to Ben, Jessi, and Hailey. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. We'll see you guys soon.